Well, hello, and welcome to this talk on Viking.TV. I'm John Maclean, and I'm a Viking resident astronomer. You may have met me on Viking Orion or Viking Jupiter during one of our fabulous cruises. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about Viking astronomy, how they saw and used the night sky during the Viking Age and beyond. Join me for Viking astronomy, fact and legend. Now, written sources about Old Norse mythology are almost always biased in some way, as almost nothing written survives in Scandinavia from the pre-Christian period, aside from runic monuments, which unfortunately don't tell us anything about astronomy. There are some contemporary Latin, Arabic and Byzantine sources for Old Norse religion, but they tend to focus only on observed ritual and not on the mythology behind the ritual. The first non-runic written sources from Scandinavia itself date from the 12th century onwards and are from the Christian period. Of these Scandinavian sources, the most detailed ones are for pre-Christian mythology, and they are the prose Edda of the Icelandic law speaker Snorri Sturluson and the anonymous collection of Icelandic mythological poems known as the Poetic Edda. Now, many of the cosmological stories retold in the Eddas have their root in Germanic cosmology, and indeed many aspects of understanding about the universe are shared between the Germanic and Scandinavian cultures. But in order to learn about Viking or Norse astronomy, we first need to understand the mythology and how they saw their universe. We need to examine their creation myths, the stories that describe the beginnings of their world and space. Virtually all cultures have a creation myth, and the Vikings were no different. In the beginning, there were two realms. One was Niflheim in the north, which was all cold and darkness, and the other was Muspelheim in the south, which was all heat and light. From Niflheim there flowed a series of poisonous rivers collectively called the Alivagar. These rivers flowed into Ginnungagap, the void between the two realms, where they froze into layer upon layer of rime frost. Now, the heat from Muspelheim melted some of this rime frost, and from that meltwater emerged the primeval giant Ymir and the cosmic cow Audhumla. And from Ymir's sweat came the race of giants. And Audhumla was sometimes known as the cosmic cow, and she licked the salt from the rime frost, and her licking formed one of the blocks into the shape of a man. The shape became animated, and the giant named Buri walked free out of the ice. Buri's grandchildren were three gods you may be familiar with: Odin, Vili, and Ve. Odin and his brothers took sparks from Muspelheim and placed them in the sky to illuminate the heaven and earth. Some of these lights became fixed, and some moved in a wandering course which was ordered by Odin and his two brothers. These were to become the stars and the sun and the moon, and we can assume the planets. Snorri mentions that ancient sources say that this is how days were distinguished and how years were counted. In his prologue, Snorri also describes how people in the past knew about these heavenly bodies and that they had various courses, or what we would call today orbits, some being longer and some being shorter than others. Of course, at this time, they didn't know what the planets actually were and that they actually orbited the sun, or even that the moon orbits the earth. They would also have believed that what they observed was everything there was. Next, the 9 worlds. The 9 worlds sit in the great world tree Yggdrasil, and they were created from the dismembered giant Ymir. His eyebrows were used to form Midgard, the world of men. The sun and the moon were known as Sol and Mani, and they were tasked with travelling around the world in their chariots. Interestingly, the sun and the moon were never depicted as gods in Norse mythology, and neither were they personalised as in Greek or Roman cultures. In fact, virtually none of the observable objects in the night skies were given names relating to humans or gods by the Vikings. Skoll and Hati were two wolves who chased the sun and the moon through the sky, with Skoll chasing the sun and Hati the moon. It's sometimes said that Hati would catch the moon and bite a chunk from it, but the moon would always recover and become whole again. Now, this was the first explanation for the phases of the moon. and it was also used to explain eclipses when the moon would cover the sun. Without the benefit of scientific discovery and explanations for natural phenomena, these were usually linked with the human experience and explained through this type of mythological story. Now, the Norsemen visualized the universe in 3 vertical levels. Between each level and its adjacent level was a space. The axis of the 3 levels and the 9 worlds was the Yggdrasil tree, a mighty ash which is timeless, has no origin, and will survive Ragnarok. So let's briefly look at the 3 levels. The first level is Asgard, world of the Aesir, or the gods. Vanaheim is the land of the Vanir, and Alfheim the land of the light elves. On the second level, we have Midgard, the land of the humans, middle world, or known as a garden. This is what we would call Earth. Then we have Nidavellir, the land of the dwarfs, Jotunheim, the land of the giants or Jotuns, and Svartalheim, the land of the dark elves. And on the third level, we have Hel, the realm of the dead, and then Niflheim, the world of the dead. And from this, we can see how some of the mythology stems. But then looking again at some of the stories, we see the Bifrost Bridge. Now, another legend is one that will be familiar to anyone who watches the Marvel movies, for instance. Bifrost, or the Rainbow Bridge, was the bridge leading from Earth, called Midgard, to Asgard, the home of the gods. Only the gods could cross this bridge, and it was guarded by the god Heimdall. Now, this bridge has also been associated with the Milky Way, and it was believed that a great battle between good and evil would end in the destruction of the gods by monsters of evil. During the battle, the Bifrost Bridge is shattered due to the weight of the monsters. In this story, all the gods and everything on Earth perished under the sea. However, Earth will rise from the waters and life will begin again. So now let's look more closely at Norse or Viking astronomy. With so few written records, it's difficult to say for sure exactly how much attention the ancient Northern Europeans paid to the stars and the sky for practical uses. But from the records we do have, we can make quite a few deductions and inferences. In fact, it seems likely that astronomy was an essential part of Norse mythological culture and as a technical component of their daily lives. They perhaps had little interest in the reasons why objects in the night sky moved the way they did or what they were made of, but eventually they realised the usefulness of celestial objects, as we will see. Now, it's been said that the Milky Way in Norse mythology represents the Bifrost Bridge, as I've said. Other stories describe it as a river, perhaps Elivagar, the Milky Way River, but with so few records it's impossible to tell. Certainly in Germanic astronomy, the Milky Way was seen as a street or a wall. It's also believed that Bifrost manifested itself as a rainbow during the daylight hours. Now, although the constellations we see here were known in the past, all but Thiassi's eyes and Nidhogg played no real role within Norse mythology. Also, it cannot be certain exactly which stars were the ones seen from those times, and this will continue unless some graphic depiction is located. The constellations are largely based upon evidence from the knowledge of Germanic mythology, and it's likely that Snorri Sturluson borrowed from Germanic culture when writing the Edda. So they're possibly modern recreations based upon the suggestion of these sources, and the ones shown here are the only ones that are known to be genuine Nordic constellations mentioned in the Eddas. Also, Snorri used many Latin names for constellations and some of the stars and objects in the night sky, which indicates that probably this came from more modern eras. Now let's look a bit more closely at some of the Nordic constellations. The constellation we know today as Ursa Major, or the Great Bear, the Big Dipper, sometimes the Wain, this was seen by ancient Norse and Teutonic people as a wagon or a chariot. It's one of the constellations that we know for certain. We also know that it was viewed as a picture in the sky. It was known by different names and therefore associated with different gods throughout Northern Europe, where it was known as Odin's wagon. It was quite obviously associated then with Odin. But some support the notion that the wain was Odin's chariot, or wagenwehr, wagon lord, or the wagon lord ruler of the wagon road, which suggests that the wagon road upon which he travelled was the heavens, hence the ruler of the heavens. It was also known as the Hellwagen, or wagon of the dead, that carried the fallen to Valhalla. The tale of how the eyes of the giant Thiassi became a constellation is recounted in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda. It's part of the longer tale of Loki conniving to kidnap Idun with the giant Thiassi. The gods then force Loki to rescue Idun, and so using Freya's cloak he transforms himself into a falcon and snatches her from Thiassi. Thiassi is killed during Idun's rescue, and when his daughter Skadi travels to Asgard seeking amends for her father's death, she's allowed to choose a husband from among the gods. But she had to choose based only on seeing their feet. Thinking she was clever, she ultimately chooses Njord, thinking the most beautiful feet must surely belong to Balder, the most handsome of all the gods. Now Loki then performs some silliness with a goat that I'll leave to your imagination in order to make her laugh. And then Odin appeases her by casting her father's eyes into the heavens, where they will shine as a constellation. Castor and Pollux are just two of the stars in the constellation Gemini, and it's likely these were the stars recognised as the eyes of Thiassi. Castor, for interest, is in fact a sextuplet, 6 stars in 3 binary pairs. But when we look at it from Earth, even through a small telescope or a pair of binoculars, it looks like one star. So these 2 stars are the most likely candidates for the eyes of Thiassi. Another of the constellations which may belong to the Viking Age is Frigga Rokke, or Frigga's distaff. The 3 bright stars that make up the belt of the constellation we know today as Orion the Hunter. In Norse mythology, Frigg or Frigga was said to be the foremost amongst all the goddesses, wife of Odin, queen of the Aesir, goddess of the sky. To explain this attribution, some scholars have pointed out that the constellation is on the celestial equator, and thus the stars rotating in the night sky may have been associated with Frigg's spinning wheel. So the Norse constellation, the Eagle, consists of largely the same stars as the modern constellation we know as Cygnus the Swan. This is one of the few constellations, either in ancient or modern times, where it's possible to clearly link the shape of the constellations with the name it's given. The Vikings saw an eagle, the Greeks saw a swan. Either way, it does look like a flying creature. Now, unlike many constellations, which even me as an astronomer have difficulty actually identifying the shape that they're named after, I think this is pretty certain that the eagle was in fact seen in ancient times. Another of the constellations is Nidhogg, the constellation of the serpent, who lived and gnawed at the roots of the world tree Yggdrasil. Nidhogg was the constellation we today call Scorpius, and we see it as a scorpion rather than a snake or serpent. And again, either way, it's a pretty good name for the shape depicted in the constellation. One constellation which has a peculiar name is Asar Bardagi. What we know today is Auriga, which is home to the bright star Capella. The Capella is unusual again, and it is actually a quadruple star system consisting of 2 binary pairs. In Norse astronomy, Asar Bardagi is the battlefield, or the fight of the Asar. And researchers Beckman and Calland interpret this name as Thor's fight, possibly based on the Greek name. But Asar is plural, so it might indicate the final battle for all Asar, and that is Ragnarok. The neighbouring constellations are equally horrifying, with the mouth of the wolf and the Milky Way as the road of the dead in the vicinity. The open star cluster known as the Hyades was also known as Ulf's Scepter, the mouth of the wolf, and may have referred to Fenrir, but it's more likely referred to Garm, the wolf who guards the gates at the end of the road to Hell, or the Helveg. These stars appear in the constellation we know as Taurus, the brightest of them forming a V shape to form the Hyades, and it's possible that the road to Hell is also the Milky Way. One of my particular favourites is a small constellation, Ratatoskr, or the Squirrel constellation, consisting of the main stars in Cassiopeia. One star for its head, one for each foot, one for its body, and two for its tail. Now, Ratatoskr is an interesting creature, as it was said to have run up and down the world tree Yggdrasil, carrying messages from the worlds below to the gods above. I'm not sure whether, again, this actually looks like a creature, but certainly it's an interesting concept. Something of a controversy with this one, because sometimes it's wrongly thought to be a Norse constellation, and that's Örvandel's Toe. Many believe it's actually the morning star, or the planet Venus. Venus and Mercury never appear full from the Earth, and they're either approaching or receding when they're on the same side of the sun as Earth is. Mercury, however, is not clearly visible and can't be seen other than as a point with the naked eye. Venus is sometimes the brightest object in the evening after sunset or in the morning after sunrise, sometimes known as the evening or morning star. And Venus was often thought to be two different objects by many in ancient times. It's often paired with the crescent moon, for both were very early associated with bear claws. Now, I particularly ascribe to the Venus argument for Örvandel's Toe, and I think that's probably the correct interpretation. Now, the mythology of the story of Örvandel's Toe tells us of the fight between Thor and the giant Hrungi. Thor was injured in the fight, and a small piece of stone got stuck in his head. In order to get it out, he sought the help from a Vala, a type of oracle named Groa. Now, when Thor felt the stone was coming out, he told Groa that he had helped her husband, Örvandel, to escape from the land of the giants. And during the escape, Örvandel got frostbite in his big toe, which Thor broke off and threw into the sky to become a star or a constellation we know, or they knew, as Örvandel's Toe. This made Groa so happy that she forgot her magic and said that Thor still has that piece of stone stuck in his head. It's also been suggested that Örvandel's Toe is the constellation Corona Borealis, mainly because it's shaped like a toe. Personally, as I've said, I subscribe to the Venus camp, but you're free to make up your own mind. Now, there are a few individual stars mentioned in the Eddas, one being what the Vikings call the day star. We know this as Arcturus in the constellation Boötes. Because of the latitude, the sun never sets at certain times of the year, but some very bright stars are still visible, Arcturus being one. There's even an old Swedish song. Now, I'm not going to sing it, but I'll tell you the lyrics. There is no sign of dawn, even if it seems to be. It is the shining star promising the day to come. And even today, Arcturus is known in Norway as the day star. Now, we find in Icelandic literature a man who was named Odd Helgason, or Star Oddi, who lived in the 11th and 12th centuries and had a reputation as a skillful astronomer. A text supposedly originating from him, the Odd Atala, includes the winter and summer solstices, and in the text he notes the position of the sun for every day of the year in Iceland. The text shows his astronomical skills, which reveal a tradition for astronomical observations, something that lost its importance with an increased literacy and an increased number of foreign and Icelandic books. Helgason's observations were very useful in the conversion to the Julian calendar in later times. However, Star Oddi only ever wrote 3 pages of text that we know of, and the extent of his observations will remain a mystery, but I'm pretty sure he made many more observations than are written down. In Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, he says, "They gave their stations to all the fires, and some fixed in the sky, some moved in a wandering course beneath the sky, but they appointed them places and ordained their courses." From these mentions, we can certainly see that the Vikings saw and observed the difference between the fixed stars and the wandering planets. We have one mention from Olafur Arnarsson's third grammatical treatise, which used the term Merkinstaria, mark star, to indicate a planet. But clearly this discussion comes from a background of continental classical education and may not reflect Viking usage. Unlike other Indo-European people such as the Greeks and the Romans, we do not have surviving Old Norse names for the planets that identified them with gods in the Scandinavian pantheon. Although clearly Old Norse preserved the deity or planet names and the adaptation of the words for the days of the week. Ares or Mars was equated with Tyr as a warrior god. Zeus, Jupiter, was equated with Thor as the god who hurled lightning bolts. Mercury was equated with Odin, since both have the role as psychopomps, the one who leads the dead to their afterlife. Aphrodite and Venus was equated with Frigga or Freya. So those are a few of the constellations that we know the Vikings recognised, and some of the stories they ascribed to them. But how did they use the stars, the sun and the moon for practical purposes? Well, early seafaring peoples often navigated along coastlines before sophisticated navigational skills were developed and tools were invented. Sailing directions helped to identify coastal landmarks, and they often used the flight paths of birds or observing currents to navigate short distances. But soon the navigators realised that celestial objects, especially stars, could be used to keep the course of a ship. It was this, combined with the use of specific items, that freed the Vikings from coastal waters and allowed them to explore further afield, possibly as far as Africa. The Vikings were known as latitude sailors, and at these times the technique of sailing along a parallel or latitude was used by observing circumpolar stars. The concept of latitudes, in the sense of angular distances from the equator, was probably not known to them. However, they did realise that when looking at the night sky, some stars within a certain radius around the celestial poles never set, and they are known as circumpolar stars. When sailing north or south, sailors observed that the celestial pole changes too, and with it the circumpolar radius. Therefore, whenever navigators see the same star transiting the meridian at the same elevation, they stay on the latitude. For them, it was sufficient to know that the connection between the elevation of stars and their course. The North Star, Polaris, was clearly an important star for navigation and was known as the lodestar or the guiding star. Now, moving on. Sailing along latitude was probably facilitated by a device that was called a sun shadow board or sun compass. 18th century sailors in the Faroe Islands were seen using a wooden disc of up to 30 centimetres in diameter with an engraved concentric rings and a central gnomon whose height could be adjusted. It was put inside a bucket with water to cancel out ship movements. However, it's quite likely that it was already used during the Viking Age. In 1948, fragments of a small wooden disc were found during historic excavations of an abandoned monastery, Unartok, in southwest Greenland. In the following decades, people started to interpret it as a navigational tool to determine the cardinal directions using the sun. This was not the only device the Vikings may have used for navigation. It's been suggested that they made use of sunstones to find the direction of the sun on cloudy days. For many years, the idea that Viking sailors used these magical crystals to navigate has been ridiculed and dismissed out of hand. And while there's no physical evidence for the navigational techniques adopted on cloudy days, there are references in the Viking sagas to sunstones being used. In 1967, Danish archaeologist Thorkild Ramskov suggested that sunstones may work by creating a pattern of light that reveals the hidden sun's location. Now, although skeptics countered that method, the method is unwieldy, if not unworkable, it does seem to hold some water, in my opinion. It's only within the last 10 years that Ramskov's theory had been put to the test, and the results claim to demonstrate that the sunstone method does work in cloudy or foggy conditions. Now, this is a short animation of how a sunstone would be used in practical situations. So sunstones, or translucent crystals of material such as calcite, are potentially useful because both they and the atmosphere behave like natural Polaroid filters. This means that they polarize light, causing its photons to vibrate in only one plane. Now here's how it works. If we put a dot on top of the crystal and look through it from below, two dots or lobes will appear either side of the dot. Then you move the crystal until the 2 points have exactly the same intensity or darkness. At that angle, the upward-facing surface indicates the direction of the sun. Now, I can assure you, I've tried this and it does work. A precision of a few degrees can be reached even under dark twilight conditions. Vikings would have been able to determine with some precision the direction of the hidden sun. And having established where the sun is, they could then use their sun compass or their sun board to establish a bearing or a heading. Now, by identifying the position of the sun on overcast days, the Viking navigator could place a candle or a lamp in line with the sun's position and read the shadow on the sun compass. Although we have little physical proof, it can be seen that combining methods well known at the time, it would have been possible for Viking seafarers to navigate the northern seas and perhaps even travel further south and west. Maybe this is how Vikings discovered the Americas before Columbus, even though they simply landed, then sailed away again. We know that during the 9th century, Vikings travelled as far as northern Africa, and this was probably done using a combination of navigational methods, including the sun compasses, sun stores, and observing the North Star, and by noting the positions of constellations, and also noting which stars rose in the east and the time at which they rose. It's also true that they sailed along coastlines, and in doing so spread their influence across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Not bad for people who at the time had no real written language. And because Vikings usually embarked on their great sailing expeditions in the summer, they wouldn't have had the benefit of dark skies to aid their navigation, and it's therefore reasonable to determine that the celestial body most used by them was the sun. Investigations are even now taking place to discover whether the Vikings reached as far down as Namibia in Africa. There is some evidence through cave drawings that they had done so. Could it be that they used celestial navigation to reach this far south? Quite possible. Now, although Vikings were also known not to really sail at night, they had some superstitions about sailing during nighttime, it's possible that they stopped on beaches and coves, etc. during the night and waited for the day to come and then carried on. But even then, they could map their position using celestial bodies. So there we have it. We've discovered that the Norse and Viking sailors were certainly aware of the usefulness of both the sun and the stars to navigate. And we've also seen how they made sense of the universe and the world around them. The Viking navigation was far from accurate, which probably explains why so many of their ships ended up in the bottom of the sea. But some of them found land and named it. For instance, Iceland and Greenland. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief sojourn into the facts and legend of the Vikings, and I'm happy to take questions if you have any. So now I'll hand you over to Heather, who is going to take the questions and pass them on to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Our first question comes from Annie in Largo in the United States, and she says, how did the Vikings explain or experience the Northern Lights?
Very interesting. Excuse me, a good question. Actually, different cultures in northern Scandinavia and Greenland and Iceland had different stories for the Northern Lights. Some thought it was the spirits of their ancestors who were calling them. Some had great superstitions. For instance, the Sami people in Finland, they thought that the Northern Lights were dangerous, and they thought that if you whistled at the Northern Lights, they would come and get you. Other cultures, the Norwegian, and Swedish cultures, believed that the Northern Lights were things like walruses playing football with the head of a human. This was Greenland, especially, had one of these stories. They thought it was this. Funnily enough, other side of the world in the Americas, some of the indigenous people in the Americas believed that it was humans playing football with the head of a walrus, so the opposite way around. So they had all sorts of stories and superstitions about the Northern Lights, but basically they thought they were either their ancestors or they were the gods.
Thank you, John. Adrian in St. Louis says, do we know, did the Vikings think that every individual star was a god in itself?
No, another good question. No, they didn't. They didn't actually recognize many of the stars that they would have been able to see, given that they would have had these dark skies that we are not blessed with these days. But they didn't seem to bother naming stars. They saw a few patterns, as I said, Odin's Wagen, and those they named, but they didn't really bother with many other stars at all. It wasn't something that was particularly important to them, and they didn't really ascribe them to gods at all, other than seeing shapes like Odin's Wagen. But there wasn't really any attempt really to identify them as gods.
Thank you, John. Connor in Utah says, what evidence has been found of how the Vikings mapped the stars? Are the maps in cave paintings, for example?
No, they aren't. And this is one of the things we'd love to find out, because virtually all the evidence we have about Viking and Norse astronomy comes from the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda. And these weren't written until the 12th and 13th centuries. So it was a long time after the first Viking age in the 9th century, for instance, that these Eddas were written. And by that time, there was a lot of Germanic and Greek influence on astronomy. And even some of that would have made its way to the areas where Snorri Sturluson, for instance, or Starodi were experiencing the night sky. And they were interpreting things based on stories, mythologies that had been told hundreds of years before. So we have never discovered any written information about astronomy from the 9th century or the 10th century. And there are only a few runic examples of things mentioning the sun and the moon. And other than that, there's virtually nothing. So everything really comes from the 13th and 12th centuries. Now, how much we can place on that to being accurate is very debatable, because it could be that Snorri Sturluson just made it all up.
Thank you, John. Adrian in Cornelius in the United States says, I think you mentioned that the Vikings used the phases of the sun and the moon to map out time. Do we know if they had any sense of using set measurements of time, such as weeks and months?
No, we don't. Again, anything comes from the 12th and 13th centuries. Starodi actually was quite influential in this, but again, he was from that period, and he was quite influential in mapping days of the week, weeks of the month, months of the year, and he used the sun and the moon to do this. But there's no real evidence that they used anything that we would recognise as a calendar as such. What they did do was they would recognise certain constellations that rose at certain times of the year. For instance, the Pleiades would rise in the spring, and that may be a time to plant. Now, you know, in the 9th century, in the 850 AD, for instance, at that time Vikings were still being adventurers, if I can put it that way, but they did farm and they did grow crops. So they may have used the Pleiades and other constellations to actually determine when it was time to plant crops, when it was time to harvest. But there was no real fixed calendar.
Thank you, John. Elsie in Winston-Salem says, is there anything in the Viking sagas that mentions shooting stars?
There is actually. I can't remember the exact saga that's in, but there is something that mentions, it does mention it. It's debatable whether it's supposed to be a shooting star or a meteor, or whether it's supposed to be a comet. But there is something I remember in one of the sagas that refers to something in the sky with a tail. So it could have been either a meteor or a comet. But again, Snorri Sturluson's accounts are based on what he experienced. And so, which is why, as I say, he gave a lot of Latin names, which wouldn't have been known to the Vikings at the time. So it may be that his experience of what he was writing stems from things that were seen way beyond the first Viking age. So there's no real record. We have no records from the first Viking age to say they saw anything, to be honest.
Thank you. Lenny in Haymarket says, how did the Norse mythologies explain the phenomenon of the midnight sun and then also the long periods of darkness during the winter?
Again, I'm sorry to keep giving this answer, but I really don't think they bothered too much. It was just something they experienced. They believed that the sun and the moon, for instance, were linked with Skoll and Hati, the two wolves who chased the sun and the moon. And they actually were responsible for the sun disappearing during the winter months and not rising, or the opposite in the summer months. So they would ascribe it to something to do with the wolves, Skoll and Hati, who were responsible for this.
Thank you. Karen in San Diego says, were there any times that the sunstone couldn't be used?
Well, I've actually used a sunstone, and I've used it at sea as well as at my home, and it does actually work. You can pinpoint the sun on a cloudy or foggy day, but if it's really, really, really thick, dark cloud or heavy fog, then no, you won't be able to see it. But having said that, it has been tested, and even when the sun is up to about 2 degrees below the horizon, you can still identify where the sun is with a calcite sunstone. Icelandic calcite is the material that the sunstone is made of. And it is quite possible in those circumstances to find the sun. But if it's really, really thick cloud, then it is a bit difficult.
Thank you. Clifton in Fort Lauderdale says, how do you think the Vikings worked out how to return home once they'd reached a new destination, I suppose?
That's an excellent question. Now, as I said in the talk, the Vikings were originally latitude sailors. So they would generally sail either east or west. Now, for instance, the Swedish Scandinavians or Swedish Vikings, you might call them, they generally went east. So they were predominantly river sailors. They sailed the rivers around Russia and the Baltic and places like that. Whereas the Norwegian and Icelandic Vikings and the Danish Vikings, they tended to go west. So they would sail across the ocean, the north, what we know as the North Sea, and above Scotland through the Faroe Islands to Iceland and Greenland. And they were latitude sailors. So basically they had a line east and west. And by using the sun, whether the sun was moving to the north or the south of the line that they had set on their sun compass, they would know whether they were too far south of the latitude or too far north of the latitude. And by doing that, they could just literally turn around. They knew where the sun was. They knew where north was and east was and south was and west was. So they could just turn the ship around and using the sun compass just go back the way they came. Now, when they broke away from being latitude sailers and coastal sailors, because they used to never really sail far away from land, so they could usually always see land if land was there. But when they broke away from that and started to sail south, and obviously across the Atlantic Ocean, then things were a bit different because they couldn't see land. They still had the sun and the moon to look at, but I think that's when they began to use some of the more celestial, the stars and celestial bodies like the stars to navigate. So, for instance, they would use the pole star. With no evidence at the time that they realised the link between the horizon and the pole star, which tells you your latitude. If you measure the distance between the horizon and the pole star in degrees, that tells you what your latitude is. There's no reason to believe that they actually knew that, but they could identify the pole star to give them a direction. So they could have easily sailed north and south in that sense, and then used the sun to keep them on an easterly or westerly course. I hope that's some sort of answer to your question.
Wonderful, thank you, John. A question now from Macy. She's in Lake St. Louis. She says, thank you for this interesting talk. Can you recommend any good books which give a comprehensive overview of Norse mythology?
Actually, there are a number of good books. If you want to, someone I know called Neil Gaiman, a guy who's quite famous for his, what do you call them, illustrated novels, as you might call them. And he also has written a few TV series that go with these books. He's written one called Norse Mythology, which is very interesting. I tend to look at more, my knowledge comes through studying Anglo-Saxon history, really, to be honest. Because the Vikings played a huge part in English history. So I was brought to it by being an astronomer. Of course, I was interested in all the astronomy of people in the past, and one of my things is what we call ethno or archaeoastronomy. So looking at astronomy in ancient times. So if you look for anything about the history of England, you'll find a lot about the history of the Vikings. I'm not aware of any books that stem from Norway or Denmark that are particular, or I've not read any that stem from there. Most of the books I've read come from the English history, which then goes into the Viking history. So there's a number of them. One of them is called the Anglo-Saxons. I can't remember the author at the moment. I should have written down a list of books. I'll do that for next time. Sorry about that.
Thank you, John. A question now from Tony in Springfield in the United States, and he says, did the Vikings believe the world was flat or round?
Again, a very good question. Thank you, Tony. What the Vikings believed was that the world consisted of Yggdrasil, the world tree. So it was on the 3 different levels, the 9 different realms and the 3 different levels. So I suppose you could say they thought the world was flat, because certainly Midgard in the 2nd level is depicted as a flat area, but and there were things above it and below it. So there's no evidence that they actually thought that the world was anything other than the Yggdrasil, the tree, the world tree. Later on, of course, in later times, beyond the 12th century, in the 13th, 14th centuries, more thought was given to whether the world was round or spherical, as opposed to being flat. And at that time, of course, the influence was coming from as far south as Mesopotamia, from the early days in Mesopotamia, that travelled up through the Middle East, through Spain, into Europe, and then from Europe up to the northern regions of Europe. And at that time, of course, it was becoming known that there were people thinking about this, people like Copernicus and Kepler and so on. So I don't think in the first Viking Age they actually saw the world as flat or spherical. They saw it as the world tree.
Thank you, John. And Shelton in Silver Spring in the United States says, did the Vikings keep maps with common reference points for later travel?
No, not in the early Viking Age. No, they didn't. Initially they didn't really deal in maps at all. A lot of it was passed on by memory and by stories, and they had these people called skalds, and these were like storytellers, and they would memorize stories about great voyages that the people had made, and they would tell the stories, retell the stories. And it would say, for instance, when the Vikings went to Ireland, they told stories about how to get to Ireland, you know, how to leave and go around the south of England and go past Wales, and you'll eventually get to Ireland. And of course, they settled there in Dublin and Wicklow, which was Wicklow as we know it in Ireland now, which was called Wicklow, which of course that name stems from Vik in Norway. So it wasn't really maps. It wasn't until much later, again in the 11th, 12th, it's the 12th, 13th centuries, that they started to really use maps. And again, it was influenced from Southern Europe and Central Europe, and certainly the Germanic influence that would cause them to start using maps.
Thank you very much. Nina in Reading says, when will you be sailing on Viking next?
As soon as possible. No, I will be on Viking Jupiter in June and July next year. I've just recently, last month, went on Viking Jupiter in Iceland. We circumnavigated Iceland at a fantastic time. I'm on in June and July next year. I'll be on for a long time, 46 nights. And that will be the Viking homelands, Russia and Iceland. So we'll be covering that, and we'll be doing lots of planetarium shows and stargazing nights and some fantastic talks about the universe and everything. I'll be talking about everything from the birth of the universe to how stars are made, journey through the solar system, and even covering extraterrestrial life, aliens and things like that. So look out for that cruise. I can't remember the cruise number. It's June and July next year, and it's Viking homelands, Russia and Iceland.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, John. I think that's all we've got time for tonight.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, everybody for the great questions. And I hope I've managed to answer some of them.